Hello, History 17B Spring Quarter 2024, and welcome to Lecture 7. Barbara and Karen Fields have coined the term racecraft to indicate, and this is a quote, the process that transforms racism, something an aggressor does, into race, something the target is. Target and aggressor are important here, as racisms, plural, are constantly made and remade to suit specific historical contexts. The morphable nature of constructions of race and racisms is highly visible in the response of white Americans to Asian immigration. This, in turn, has had a deep impact on many different Asian American communities. Stanford law professor Bill Ong-hing wrote in 1993 that policymakers, commentators, and experts appear to me to know little about or to misunderstand Asian American demographics. They seemed not even to understand that there are multiple Asian American communities rather than some single monolithic one. They were both unaware of and seemingly uninterested in how demographics affect the experiences of Asian Americans. Most experts just do not have a full sense of the history of Asian Americans. I will try to keep this in mind myself as I go through this and future lectures, but please don't hesitate to contact me if you think that I've muffed it in parts or all. This lecture only covers Chinese immigration so far. Japanese immigrants started to arrive in the time period of this module, Module B, but there was not yet substantial resistance to them, and appreciable groups of Filipino and South Asian immigrants did not begin to arrive until the 1890s. So we will put them into the story when we get there. However, the pattern of recruitment for labor followed by rejection and often violence that we see early with the Chinese is something that we will see repeated with each group of immigrants from Asia. In the second part here, I will be focusing on the white American responses as these shaped laws and policies at all levels, from the municipal or city government to U.S. national government. And finally, I will discuss the ways that different communities responded on the ground to institutionalized racism from white Americans. In part one here, we will look at the beginnings of a pattern of alternating periods of encouragement and denial of immigration that would characterize immigration from Asia from the mid-1800s to at least the 1920s. This pattern began with people arriving from China. When we get to other groups, then we have the pattern and can focus on the differences. I've put a timeline here for events in Asian immigration in Module B. I will be pulling up this timeline again through the lecture, so don't feel like you have to read it all now. This screen is the time period of the lecture. I've also put a nod to what was happening earlier on the far left and to what will come in later modules on the right. Japanese immigration to Hawaii began here in 1884, but otherwise most events in our current time period related to Chinese immigration. The first group of Asian immigrants who came to North America in appreciable numbers came from China, beginning in the 1840s. These were pushed from China by famine, war, and Britain's imperial ambitions, and they were pulled to North America by the lure of gold and food. Initially, these Chinese immigrants were officially welcomed, receiving accolades for their work ethic and abilities. You are looking at a group of miners working side by side, 4 from China and 3 from either Europe or the US. And I put the push factors here, the things happening in China that pushed people to immigrate away. Huge population increase between 1779 and 1850, food shortages, Qing dynasty government weakened by 1839 to 42 opium wars with Britain, and 1850 to 1864 Taiping Rebellion. And the pull factors were gold discovered in the late 1840s, largely in California here, and active recruitment of Chinese labor for railroad construction, laundries, and domestic service. The first laws that negatively affected Chinese immigrants were actually aimed at Latinos initially. To reduce competition for gold, Irish, German, and white American miners called for the expulsion of Latino gold miners. California responded with state and local laws that demanded exorbitant taxes from anyone deemed not American, meaning not white. Latinos chose to leave rather than pay the ridiculous taxes, and with their departure, the Chinese immigrants who were lower in number became ever more visible to resentful whites. New taxes directed towards foreign miners, but now specifically aimed at Chinese immigrants, cropped up in Oregon as well as California. San Francisco newspapers published vituperative anti-Chinese editorials, stoking the cycle of fear, anger, and rejection. Nevertheless, around 24,000 people migrated from China by 1853. These were almost entirely young men. Chinese immigrants were not welcome for gold mining, which might make them independent and supposedly deprive white Americans of riches they felt they had a right to. But American employers did send agents to recruit Chinese labor for coal mining, laundry, domestic service, and especially building railroads. It is widely understood that without Chinese labor, the Transcontinental Railroad would not have existed until decades later, if it were finished at all. I've included this image because I think that we often picture laying tracks on flat ground. Those are the most common images, but railroad work involved reshaping the landscape, cutting and transporting wood for ties and for trestles to make bridges, as well as moving rails from the steel mills that made them, not just hammering those rails into place. The wealthy men backing the railroads employed a lot of people, which meant that when the railroads were finished, so were a lot of jobs. Railroads being built eastwards from the West Coast, especially California, recruited both in China and among Chinese immigrants who had arrived to mine for gold but had been shut out. Chinese workers were highly sought after for hard labor because they accepted dangerous jobs, did them well, and agreed to quite low wages compared to other groups, especially white laborers. We will come back to that later in the lecture. This image shows white workers setting ties, those are the wooden cross pieces, and laying rails, those are the iron long pieces. This work was arduous, but it was far less dangerous than the tasks assigned to Chinese laborers. The Central Pacific Railroad, in green here, employed Chinese labor when their white workforce went on strike. Central Pacific employed 10,000 Chinese workers, representing 90% of its workforce during the building of the transcontinental railroads. The Northern Pacific, in red up here, employed 15,000 Chinese workers, also representing the majority of their workforce. Employers loved Chinese laborers. White laborers did not share that enthusiasm, as they lost jobs, or more to the point, believed that they did, to Chinese workers. With the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869, Chinese labor became less indispensable to the big venture capitalists backing the scheme. Chinese labor was still used to make other railroad branches, but those who built the smaller railroads got grants of land and money from the US government. They could afford to drive harder bargains with labor and to indulge anti-Chinese white laborers by making life far more difficult for Chinese immigrants. The big railroads did continue to hire Chinese workers, but now mainly in the mining of coal. The trains burned coal to make the steam on which they ran. This will become important in the second part of this lecture, so store it away in the back of your mind. National laws placed more and more restrictions on legal Chinese immigration, relegating laborers to an increasingly tenuous and dangerous position. You've seen this slide before. I'm just going to point out the proximity in time between the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the first national law limiting opportunity for Chinese immigrants. 1869 for the completion of the railroad, 1870 for the first law against Chinese immigrants. In 1870, people of Chinese origin were denied the right to become naturalized citizens of the US at all. I'm going to remind you of the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship here. It will come up in a future lecture. The wording here was not no Chinese, but by omission, not unlike women from the 15th Amendment. What you are looking at here on this particular slide is the Nationality Act of 1790, so way before our class. But you will notice that it only sets up the parameters of naturalization for white persons, whatever that is interpreted as being. Reading Section 1, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof, and so on. The Naturalization Act of 1870 was an amendment to naturalization law already established. It was mainly concerned with dealing with all types of dishonest ways that someone could attain citizenship, like impersonating someone else or forging documents. But the very last section of the 1870 Act extended naturalization to Black people. Seems like it basically just catches the law up to the 14th Amendment, right? But just as sex as a protected category was quite deliberately left out of the 15th Amendment, people from Asia are quite deliberately omitted here. Section 7, and be it further enacted that the naturalization laws are hereby extended to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. In 1875, the U.S. Congress passed the Page Law. Supposedly, the legislation was aimed to prevent the importation of women for immoral purposes. In reality, all Chinese women were assumed to be prostitutes by immigration officials. Wives were permitted to join male merchants, teachers, and students, but they had to supply incontrovertible evidence that they were married, a process that could literally take years. This effectively left Chinese laborers without families that included women and skewed sex ratios to almost totally male. By this time, anti-Chinese sentiment had spread beyond the West to states like Alabama, Ohio, West Virginia, and Wisconsin, well in advance of appreciable numbers of actual Chinese people. The U.S. Congress responded to nationwide anti-Chinese prejudice with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which did exactly what it sounds like and banned Chinese immigration for a period of 10 years. This is a newspaper headline from the time. It says, "The Democratic Chinese Exclusion Bill has been signed by our Democratic president." And then it literally says, "Hip hurrah, the white man is on top. Let every Democrat and all other good citizens turn out and ratify this democratic measure." They clearly had a different definition of democratic than I have now. I will point out here that making immigration illegal does not stop people in desperate situations from entering the country, but it does make their lives more difficult. I will also point out that companies with coal mines continued to recruit and hire Chinese workmen, and there was no law preventing them from doing so. We've seen that national, state, and local leaders supported recruitment of Asian immigrants as labor for fields, mines, railroads, and domestic help. The point was sometimes to undercut white workers. We saw that with the Central Pacific Railroad, but often it was to fill positions left vacant by white American workers who moved on to safer and better paying jobs. Either way, white working class Americans resented hiring practices and labor conditions overall. We saw that developing in Lecture 5 with industry and organized labor. White workers could not touch bosses, and on a national level had already developed the practice of creating racisms with Native Americans and African Americans. Predictably, working class whites directed their anger at Asian immigrants. The white middle and upper classes had no problem benefiting from that prejudice. Once the labor of any particular group of immigrants from Asia could be replaced or was no longer needed, then the national government would step in to supposedly prevent immigration of particular Asian groups in response to popular white angst and prejudice. And you could see carrying on from the 1870 Naturalization Law to 1875 Page Law and 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Employers could use the US government to increase or decrease the Chinese labor force with immigration laws and to make certain that only able-bodied men were permitted into the country and that they could be deported as soon as they became too expensive to feed and house and started cutting into profits. These are the railroad tycoons who profited from this system. One image only has 4, but it shows the name of the fellow that we see at the center on the left. That would be Leland Stanford. And yes, Stanford University is named for him. Also, the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento is named for Charles Crocker, and the Huntington Library is named for Mr. Huntington here. Employers took advantage of the reality that Chinese workers often arrived not speaking English, had no family to support them, and did not know the country, combined with the issues of returning to China to give Chinese workers the most dangerous and labor-intensive work. I went over this in live lecture, but if you weren't in live lecture, you'll hear it now. And if you were in live lecture, this gives you a chance to see what I was talking about. If you think about railroad tunnels of the 19th century, there was no large earth-moving equipment of any kind. Mountains were blasted with dynamite, and then the resulting boulders were broken up with pickaxes and hammers and removed by hand before the blasting process was repeated deeper into the mountain. No sophisticated explosives or igniting mechanisms, but placing dynamite by hand and lighting fuses. This is the sort of dangerous and back-breaking work that I am talking about, jobs that white workers would take only if they were starving. I know it's hard to make out on this picture because the people kind of blend in with the boulders, but this man here is holding a hammer, and this man back here has a pick, and they are breaking up the rocks. And here you can see the fall of rocks that's being partially cleared away in a tunnel that's being built, and this man is carrying away the rocks in buckets on his shoulders. Since Chinese workers could not live with families, it was easier for employers to move these men quickly from camp to camp. While employers had no intention of giving up their cheap, expendable labor, they also did nothing to lessen the resentment of white workers who felt that they lost out on safer work because they asked higher wages. Violence against Chinese workers was not uncommon, and eventually it led to the Rock Creek Massacre. Steam engines ran on coal, and coal was, at the time, the fuel of choice in factories and furnaces. Coal was the main reason the railroad followed the route that it did across southern Wyoming. Remember that we talked about the ways in which industrial capitalists controlled multiple levels of production as well as different sources of production. Well, Union Pacific trains ran on coal from rich Union Pacific coal mines in Carbon, Wyoming, near Medicine Bow, in Rock Springs, and in Almy, near Evanston. Don't worry about the specific names, just know that they're all in this region. Once the railroads were built, that labor could be transferred into coal mines. Coal mining was not and is not, for that matter, for the faint of heart. On the upper right is a pit pony pulling a load of coal. The men digging are using pickaxes way back there, further back in the tunnel, often without enough room to stand. Initially, most of the miners at the Rock Springs location were white. When Union Pacific felt that profits were not high enough, the railroad saved money by cutting the miners' pay. And then, on top of that, to keep profits higher, the miners and their families were required to shop for food, clothes, and tools, which they had to purchase with their own money. Tools were not provided by Union Pacific. They were only allowed to buy all of that at the company's stores, where prices were high. There were strikes about wage cuts and more strikes about having to shop at the company's stores. After one strike in 1871, the company fired the strikers and brought in Scandinavian miners ready to work for less and follow the rules, for a while anyway. In 1875, after another strike, the company brought in additional Chinese miners ready to do the same. I'm sorry about my rabbit in the background. The strategy of bringing in miners from other countries worked. Oh, and also, both times, federal troops came in and the strikers lost the struggle. These strikes were some of the labor action going on before the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 to the east. After the 1875 strike, the Rock Springs mines started up again with about 150 Chinese miners and only 50 white ones. By 1885, there were nearly 600 Chinese and 300 white miners working the Rock Springs mines, plural. White workers, mostly Irish, Scandinavian, English, and Welsh immigrants, lived in downtown Rock Springs. These white workers could have family with them. The Chinese men lived in what the whites called Chinatown, to the northeast, on the other side of a bend in the railroad tracks. There, most Chinese miners lived absolutely packed, as you see here, into small wooden houses that the company had built for them. Although some Chinese men built their own shacks and sold goods and services to the Chinese miners. Although they worked side by side every day, white and Chinese miners spoke separate languages and lived separate lives. Because the Chinese miners were willing to work for lower wages, everyone's wages stayed low. This was not really on the radar of the Chinese workers who were just trying to get by. Minimal pay was fine with the company, of course, but white miners resented it. They joined the Knights of Labor that we talked about in Lecture 5. After yet another strike in 1884, mine managers in Rock Springs were told to hire only Chinese workers. Note that that was 2 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act. White laborers could not even come close to company owners, the ones actually calling the shots, but they could get close to the Chinese miners. In the summer of 1885, there were scattered threats against and actual beatings of Chinese men across Wyoming in Cheyenne, Laramie, and Rawlins. Threatening posters turned up in the railroad towns, warning the Chinese to leave Wyoming territory or else. Of course, These were in English, which vanishingly few of the Chinese laborers could read, and in towns that were off limits to them anyway. These warnings were really meant for company officials, and company officials ignored them, as well as direct warnings from the Union. On the morning of 2 September 1885, a fight broke out between white and Chinese miners in the number 6 mine in Rock Springs. The white men killed a Chinese miner by using their mining picks on his skull. Another Chinese man was badly beaten. Finally, the foreman arrived and told the miners to get back to work. But instead of going back to work, the white miners went home and fetched guns and hatchets and knives and clubs. Miners from other mines began to join them. Shortly after noon, between 100 and 150 armed white men convened at the railroad tracks near the number 6 mine. They were joined by white women and children from Rock Springs. These people surrounded Chinatown as well as the number 3 mine. Then they did what they had gathered to do, murdering any Chinese person they could get their hands on, looting the buildings of Chinatown, and then setting them on fire. The newspaper on the slide is the Indiana Sentinel of 8 September 1885. You could see that they cast what was clearly a massacre as a conflict and failed to point out that all of the dead were Chinese. Reading the slide, headline, "A Deadly Conflict Between White Miners and Chinese at Rock Springs, Wyoming Territory. 15 killed and a large number wounded, several burned to death and the rest driven into the mountains. All quiet at present." This story is bad enough at this point, but it becomes worse and worse. With Chinatown burning, the white mob confronted the company bosses who hired the Chinese. Unlike the Chinese miners, the white bosses were given a chance to leave town on the next train. This they did. In Cheyenne, territorial governor, Wyoming was not a state at this point. Territorial Governor Francis E. Warren notified Union Pacific officials who took a special train from company headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, picked up Warren and went on to Rock Springs. There, the governor and bigwigs started negotiations with white miners, who eventually cooled down some in the presence of political and business leaders who had already sent telegrams to then American President Grover Cleveland and Army officials requesting troops. So the white miners knew that U.S. troops would be coming in. Meanwhile, west of Rock Springs, striking white miners at Almy warned the Chinese laborers that if they dared to go to work, they would not leave the mines alive. Troops arrived in Rock Springs about that time, U.S. troops, and some of these troops escorted Chinese men from their camp at Almy to the relative safety of a much larger Chinatown in the nearby municipality of Evanston. The company assured the Chinese men they evacuated that their property at Almy would be safe. You will be unsurprised, I think, to learn that as soon as they were gone, white miners looted and destroyed the vacant homes. By now, like most rational people, the Chinese wanted to get out of Wyoming as soon as possible. Chinese workers requested 2 months of back pay, meaning pay for work that they had already done, from railroad officials so that they could escape. The railroad officials refused. 250 white citizens of Evanston handed Territorial Governor Warren a petition asking that the Chinese be paid off so they would have enough money to leave. The governor refused to do anything. This was a matter between the company and its workers, Warren said. None of his business. More troops, U.S. troops, finally arrived in Rock Springs and Evanston. The article that I'm showing you here is from the Las Vegas Daily Gazette. I included it as a rare example of news coverage sympathetic to the Chinese who had been murdered and displaced. The headline reads, "Worse than reported. Instead of having been exaggerated, as is usually the case in places where riots have occurred, it seems that the reports sent out yesterday day were meager in comparison with the real state of affairs. Hundreds of Chinamen in the mountains in a starving condition, afraid to go in search of food. The attack a pre-concerted affair. In other words, they're acknowledging that white people planned this. And then it goes into more detail. I put the article in case you want to read it, but you get the point. I try to avoid sharing racist and xenophobic cartoons of the era because they are horrible. In this case, though, before I tell you the last part of the Rock Springs massacre story, I want to show you what the news coverage in much of the US looked like. Eventually, the Union Pacific officials gathered about 600 surviving Chinese men in Evanston. Under the protection of armed guards, they were taken to the train depot, loaded on boxcars that they couldn't see out of, and told they were headed at last to San Francisco in safety. This is Wyoming here, Wyoming. This is the part we're talking about here, enlarged here. Without the knowledge of the escaping Chinese workers, however, a special car carrying Territorial Governor Warren, who apparently did think it was his business after all, and top Union Pacific officials, was attached to the back of the train. About 250 soldiers were on board as well. The train left Evanston, but traveled east, not west. It arrived in Rock Springs that evening. At the depot, an angry crowd of white miners had gathered, so the train continued a little further, stopping just west of where Chinatown had been. The boxcar doors opened. The Chinese men realized they had been tricked and brought right back to the Rock Springs mines. For obvious reasons, the Chinese miners really did not want to go back to work. Again, they asked for their back pay, and again, they were refused pay or passage on the railway to safety by company officials. Finally, the company's store refused to sell food or anything else to the Chinese who were not working and threatened to evict them from their temporary boxcar homes. Faced with starvation and little chance of escape, most returned to work in the coal mines. About 60 refused to work and left Rock Springs on foot. I don't know what became of them. I would like to bring up again the idea white Americans had of a free contract between employers and employees. For most of the country, the news that they got was incomplete, if I'm generous. White Americans not in close proximity could shrug their shoulders and say, well, the Chinese broke their contract. As a quick reminder, before we look at how Chinese immigrants coped with all of this in daily life, control over Asian American lives took shape through discriminatory rules on land ownership, business operations, education, civil rights, and taxes, much as we've seen local and state laws used in the Jim Crow South to restrict life for Black people. At the national level, as we've seen in this lecture, in 1870, the US government passed legislation making it impossible for Chinese immigrants to become naturalized citizens. And the 1875 Page Law ensured that most women and families would be kept out. Employers recruited young men in China and brought them to California and Oregon, knowing that state and local statutes would prevent incoming Chinese laborers from owning land, establishing businesses, or taking higher paid forms of employment. All of this meant that up to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, of the close to 40,000 Chinese immigrants to the continental US, only 116 were women. Initially, when young Chinese men came to the United States, they planned to return home to family, either natal, meaning birth family, or marital family, with money to help out. We know that gold mining turned out to be a losing proposition for pretty much all individual miners, and prospects for Chinese gold miners became even more dismal when they were subjected to absurdly high taxes. Because of the severity of the push factors, the conditions in late Qing dynasty China, most of these men accepted employment either mining for corporations or working on railroads or both. Once work on railroads and in mines started to dry up, many of the laborers who could went to California to settle or find work, as other states like Oregon began to pass even more strict laws excluding Chinese Americans. The exception to this was the northeastern US, New York in particular, that tended to attract students, diplomats, and merchants from China, but not manual laborers. In California, men who came from rural areas in China settled in rural areas in California if they could. Over the decades, they formed families. Children from the farms that these first generation immigrants created often left for college and did not return to farming, choosing instead to settle in metropolitan regions. Men who either did not want or were not able to create farmsteads, and men pushed out of small towns, moved to urban areas looking for work. Landlords generally refused to rent to Chinese Americans, and realtors would usually not sell to them. This meant that Chinese men settled together in enclaves or so-called Chinatowns. The images here on the slide are from San Francisco, which served as the regular port of entry for Chinese immigrants from the 1830s. Men created formal associations, often based on region of origin in China and family relationships. These associations supplied economic help as well as meeting social, political, and educational needs. These Chinatowns became self-sufficient as people who were refused employment in white businesses formed their own small family-run businesses. While this skewed sex ratio would not even out until World War II, prior to 1924's hard closure of U.S. borders to everyone, some families joined the men by living 5 years in Canada or Mexico and entering the US as a citizen of one of those countries. Chinatowns formed in LA and other cities, but here I'm using pictures of San Francisco in the lecture. There are pictures from the original LA Chinatown in the coda. This is another image of San Francisco's Chinatown taken in 1851. When we talk about Western cities in the 19th century, they were not like New York or London. It's often not even easy to see, as here, the cities that they would become. I will add here one last bit of American anti-Chinese legislation at the national level. The 1888 Scott Act prohibited the entry of all Chinese laborers, including those who had left the U.S. temporarily with valid return permits issued by the government. Those who were visiting family in China when the law was passed were prevented from returning, even if they had received explicit permission to return before leaving. Key points for Lecture 7. Immigration from regions of Asia to the U.S. followed a repeating pattern in which incomers were initially welcomed for their labor, but then subject to extreme racial prejudice. From cities to the national government, policies and laws penalized and regulated immigration from Asia, even while the labor of these immigrants remained essential to businesses like agriculture, railroads, and mines. Chinese immigrants began to arrive in the United States in appreciable numbers in the 1840s, pushed by famine and pulled by the discovery of gold. Discriminatory taxes made gold mining pretty much impossible, so workers took jobs in mines and on the transcontinental railroads. Chinese laborers were essential to the successful construction of the first transcontinental railroad in the U.S. Once the railroad was complete, the U.S. government enacted an increasingly restrictive series of laws to limit Chinese immigration. Chinese communities ended up being heavily skewed male because laborers could not bring wives or families. The Page Law of 1875 made the uneven sex ratio in Chinese American communities greater by labeling all Chinese women seeking to immigrate as sex workers and requiring prospective immigrants to provide definitive proof that they were not. The Chinese Exclusion Law of 1882 made immigration from China illegal, noting that illegal and impossible are not the same thing. American railroad and coal mining companies, often owned by the same men, continued to recruit Chinese laborers after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Chinese laborers were generally given extremely dangerous jobs that white workers did not want. Nevertheless, white workers resented Chinese workers who accepted lower wages and who were brought in to replace striking white workers. Company owners were aware of white working class resentment, but they did nothing to assuage it or prevent violence against Chinese people, as long as it was not enough to interfere with business operations. In 1885, white coal miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming, massacred Chinese miners and destroyed their homes. The territorial governor of Wyoming and the mine officials conspired to keep surviving Chinese laborers from leaving the mines in Wyoming. The federal government did leave enough troops in the region to keep a large massacre from occurring again. Once jobs on the railroad and in mines dried up, Chinese and Chinese American people headed to California. Some were able to find land and farm, but many settled in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. Because of racist rental and hiring laws that prevented them from living or working in white areas, Chinese and Chinese American people settled in enclaves called Chinatowns, where they built their own homes, businesses, and community. In the coda here, we will look at the Los Angeles Chinatown. The LA Chinatown was begun in 1852 and was well formed by 1870. Then, in 1931, the Supreme Court approved the destruction of LA's Chinatown in order to build Union Station. After that, Chinatown was rebuilt in the location it holds now, not in its original location because Union Station was there. The photos in this coda here are from the original Chinatown. They were all taken in 1900, so a couple of decades after the time period of Module B, but I couldn't find earlier images easily without actually going to archives. This photo says that it was taken near the intersection of Alameda Street and Marchessault Street. The person off the right edge of the photo here is probably a woman. And note the telegraph poles and wires here. These portraits were taken at studios in Old Chinatown, LA, but neither the subjects nor the photographers are named on them. The image on the left appears to have been taken outdoors, but neither the men in the photo nor the photographers' names have survived. The subject and photographer of the picture on the right are unknown, but we can see the name of the studio printed on the lower frame. This photo was taken at an unnamed restaurant in Old Chinatown, LA. And finally, our background for this lecture is a fan that was made in China for export to the West in the second half of the 19th century. The leaves of the fan are made of silk satin embroidered with silk thread. The two sides have the same basic layout, so this is one side and the other. But if you look closely, they are different to one another. The side that I used a detail of has a butterfly in the open area on the right, and the reverse has a bird there. There are other differences as well, but that one was easy to point out. The sticks are made of carved ivory. The tassel with the decorative knot is made of silk. This particular object is found in the Los Angeles County Museum, better known as LACMA.